Thank you very much, Brian, and thank you to all of you for coming out tonight. I'm going to give you a bit of an overview of what I've been working on and what we are facing as a nation when it comes to our debt and our spending. And then I want to take lots and lots of questions. So be thinking about those as I go. Be talking for about 30 minutes. That'll be my goal, and then take questions. So I've decided to title this talk Diffusing the Debt Bomb, because in many ways the United States fiscal crisis is already in full swing. For about 10 years ago, I would give talks about how can we avoid a US fiscal crisis. And now it seems to me that we're already in it. It's just that it doesn't feel perhaps the way that some people envision it. Like, it's not like we're in some Armageddon scenario. Most of us are able to just go about our regular days, go to work, tend to our families, take care of our communities. And so what do I mean that we're already in a fiscal crisis? Well, there's a couple of reasons for this, but I think the biggest issue that we face is that it's not clear that a fiscal crisis is going to be a major boom, like, wow, this just happened, in the way a financial crisis works, where all of a sudden the stock market crashes and people are out of jobs and people are hurting and suffering. That's not necessarily how a fiscal crisis manifests itself. It can be much more subtle than that. It can be in the lost opportunities that we don't see. It can be in the economic growth that doesn't happen, in the income and wage gains that people don't realize, that they don't even know, because you don't know what you don't know. And that type of a fiscal crisis is much more of a silent crisis. And it's one where we have more stagnation than growth. We have less innovation and prosperity than we would otherwise have. And the debt drags down growth and drags down investment, which hinders future prosperity, innovation, and jobs. And that is the kind of fiscal crisis I think we're already in. But there is the potential for that big boom moment. And in that way, the debt is like a bomb, where the fuse is already lit. We just don't know exactly when it's going to explode. And what that might look like what would that big boom moment potentially mean for the United States? One of the issues is that it is unprecedented for a nation as large and as wealthy, that is the world's reserve currency, to experience such a moment. When we think of hyperinflation, where inflation is in the double digits and potentially triple digits, so much worse than what we've been experiencing here since the pandemic, we think of countries like Venezuela, Zimbabwe, Germany, and the Weimar Republic. And so it's really hard for the American people, and I think US lawmakers, to even imagine such a severe scenario in the US context. And I don't think that it would happen next year, or perhaps not even in 5 years, but I wouldn't rule it out over the next 20 years. And the drivers that could potentially lead to that big boom moment, what would that look like? I like to sometimes describe it as a debt doom loop, where what we pay to service our debt, the interest we pay on our debt, drives up interest costs, which means we have to borrow more just to pay the interest on our debt, which drives up debt, and you end up in this vicious cycle. And that is the debt doom loop. And when you're in that situation, the US Congress will be confronted with very hard choices. Do we cut spending significantly immediately at the cost of doing harm, putting people out of work with government contracts getting canceled, cutting people off of vital government benefits? Do we massively raise taxes? And that also will drop economic growth. And that doesn't help us deal with the debt either. Or, and this is the most likely scenario, I'm afraid, do we just print more money? And then what happens? Then when you print money to pay your interest on the debt, then you potentially have a massive amount of inflation, and that's where the potential for hyperinflation comes in. And the other issue is that the way that the bond markets work is they have this winner-takes-all nature, where right now the US Treasury bonds and the dollar are seen as the most secure asset in global bond markets. So when there's, a recession, a financial crisis, even overseas, people will rush into US government bonds. That buys us a lot of wiggle room. It allows us to spend more, borrow more, and not face the consequences. But if there were to be an alternative currency to the US dollar, an alternative asset that markets desired as much as they desire treasury bonds right now, and those investors that are funding our debt right now were to lose confidence in the US's ability or willingness to service its debt without just inflating away the value, that's when we may find ourselves in that hyperinflation, that doom loop that could potentially topple the US dollar as the world's reserve currency. And then be thinking about who's going to step into that power vacuum that we would leave. On that cheery note, I brought you some charts tonight. This graphic shows you the United States debt in a historical context. So we're starting in 1900 over here, and I'm projecting out for an additional 30 years down here at that orange end, and I must use this direction, otherwise you can't hear me. And you can see where we are right now, here in 2023, debt as a percentage of the economy is about as big as the entire economy, 100% of GDP. Now, why should we care about this? Well, one reason is because we have robust economic research that shows that when debt exceeds about 80% of GDP, so in that realm here, it starts dragging down economic growth. And significantly, with the American people suffering thousands of dollars in income losses on a per capita basis, compared to if we didn't have debt that was this high. But this is the costs that we don't see, right? It's the lost economic growth. And so we're already at that level. And then we are projected to go to record levels that have never before been seen in the United States, not during World War II, not during World War I. And the issue we have is that while during those war periods, it was very obvious what was driving up the debt. It was to finance the war. We had to do that, that made sense. And then our debt would decline once the war was over. But now we are in a period where, because of structural imbalances with the US federal budget, not driven by temporary crises or by a major war, the aid that we're providing to Ukraine and even any aid that Congress might provide to Israel will in no way come even close to the war effort we undertook during World War II. That's not what's driving the debt. It is structural budget problems that we can only fix if we reform the programs that are driving that. And, well, I want to say one more thing before I move on. Another way to think about this projection for the next 30 years is that over the entire history of the United States, we have borrowed about $26 trillion. That's about as big as our economy is. Over our entire history, what, 250 some years? 70 by now, probably. Over the next 30 years, the US federal government is projected to borrow 4 times the amount that the US government borrowed over our entire history as a nation. Over the next 30 years, 4 times, $110 trillion to double debt as a percentage of GDP. It is unclear who will be willing to finance all this borrowing, who will be willing to finance all this debt. China and Japan, who are our 2 largest bondholders at the moment, they are reducing their bond purchases of US debt. China for strategic reasons as well, Japan for financial reasons, And so who's going to buy all this debt? And what happens if they're not willing to buy this debt? It'll drive up interest rates, and we might enter that debt doom loop. Okay, let's talk about what's underlying all this debt. It is primarily a spending problem, and we'll talk about taxes in a minute. Congress has been debating a lot about whether there will be a government shutdown, and that part of the budget is at the very bottom. It's that gray bar called discretionary spending. That is what Congress debates and votes on every year. That portion of the budget as a percentage of our economy, in overall spending terms, has actually been declining. That's not the problem. What has been growing is interest on the debt, as our debt has been growing, Social Security, due to the retirement of the baby boomers and the fact that the program was not structured in a way where it is truly self-financing. We are already running deficits. And Medicare and other healthcare programs, which are growing faster than the economy each and every year. One of the main drivers of healthcare spending is that we've become wealthier as a nation, and wealthier nations tend to value and invest more in the health of their people, and that's all good and well. The problem we have in the United States is that our system is much more costly than most health systems around the world. We have about the same utilization levels. It's not like Americans use a lot more healthcare than people do in other countries, but we pay a lot more for the healthcare that we get. And a big driver of our healthcare costs is that our system is unnecessarily convoluted, and we have huge administrative and legal burdens that other countries do not face. And so we need to reform that if we're going to fix what's primarily, actually, and I have some charts to demonstrate this, a healthcare spending crisis. Social Security is part of the problem, but one thing that happens with Social Security is that as the baby boomers started retiring in larger numbers by about 10,000 people a day in about 2011, and that continues to this day, Social Security is growing from about 4% of GDP to about 6% of GDP. So it's growing by about 50%. Maybe we don't want to spend that much on Social Security. Maybe we do. The important thing is that it is not unsustainable. It is just becoming more expensive. It is unsustainable when it grows into perpetuity faster than our economy, faster than the ability of the American people to pay for it, which, looking at GDP or economic growth is one way of considering that. When a program grows faster than our ability to sustain that program, that's when we say it's unsustainable. And that is the case with healthcare. No other budget category other than healthcare and interest on the debt is unsustainable. Everything else becoming more expensive, but not the driver of our debt crisis. And interest on the debt is not something we can just cut. The only way we can keep interest costs down is, we can try to manipulate it with the Federal Reserve, but when they do that, that can also result in inflation, which is why they've actually been raising rates in order to control inflation. The best way that we can control what we pay in interest on the debt is to reduce the overall size of our debt. It's as simple as that. If, same for you. If you have credit card debt, the best way to lower the interest you pay on your credit card debt is to, pay down your balance. And that's what we need to be doing as well. So let's talk a little bit about taxes. So here's a historical view of taxes as a percentage of GDP. And what you can roughly see is that historically the United States has been able to collect at varying tax rates. We did have at one point in our history tax rates at, this was in the 70s, at about 90% of every additional dollar. So the highest income earners paid significant taxes, 90 cents on every dollar above a certain amount. But the fluctuations you observe in tax revenue are less correlated with the tax rate that the government charges and much more strongly correlated with how the economy is doing. If the economy is growing, if the economy is in a recession, that's where you see the ups and downs on the tax revenue bar, which is the black bar on the bottom. Spending has been an average of about 21% of GDP of our economy, but it's growing rapidly. Over the next 10 years to 25% of GDP, that's a quarter of our economy. And over the next 30 years to 30% of GDP, so almost 1/3 of everything we produce in the United States will be dedicated to government spending. But it's going to be really difficult to raise our revenue above 17–18% of GDP sustainably without not just tax increases on the wealthy. My colleague Brian Riedel recently ran the math where he said, if we really squeezed every last penny out of the wealthy, how much money could we possibly get? And how much might that be able to close our funding gap? Now, keep in mind, we're talking from 18% to 30 at the end of the 30-year period. And he said, he calculated that we could get about 2 percentage points more. So maybe we could get revenue at 20% of GDP if we're lucky. But that assumes that they don't all move to Switzerland or other places where they're not sucking them dry. And the wealthy tend to be much more mobile and much more creative with figuring out how to avoid taxes through perfectly legal maneuvers and strategies, or just moving. And as we saw with Jeff Bezos, I don't know how many of you saw this, but Washington State recently introduced a very high wealth tax. About half of the revenue that they were planning to collect would have come from one single individual, Jeff Bezos of Amazon. And he announced he's moving to Florida. So, but yeah, even if we manage to squeeze every last penny out of the wealthy, we might get to about 20% of GDP. We would still have a massive funding gap that is unsustainable, much larger than our economy. Our economy is unlikely to grow at 5 or 10% every year. And if our deficit grows at those rates, that is unsustainable. So the only way we could reasonably get our revenue line up is if we adopted an entirely new layer of taxation. And there we can look to Europe. How is it that they are able to collect so much more in tax revenue than we do in the United States? What's their secret? 2 things. They squeeze lower income people and the middle class. Just to give you an example, in Denmark, if you make over $80,000 a year, which is a nice salary, but depending on where you live, is not going to make you wealthy. You might be able to feed your family with $80,000 a year. In Denmark, the tax rate you would pay above $80,000 a year is 56%. The lower income and middle class people pay very high taxes in Europe. And and the other way they do it is they have a value-added tax, which is basically a national sales tax, a consumption tax, where everything you buy gets taxed, not just by your state government. Many of us suffer from sales taxes at the state level, but by the federal government. And those sales taxes in Europe are very, very high. In Germany, where I come from, they're 18%. They might be 20 by now. I think they were talking about raising them. And so that's what it would take. We would all have to pay more in taxes. This is not something we can load off onto the rich. My colleague Adam Michel did a calculation where he looked at, because the current debate in Washington is, oh, the Trump tax cuts will expire in 2025. What are we going to do? Are we going to raise taxes on most Americans? Because most Americans got a tax cut under the Trump tax plan. But that could make our deficit worse. So how do we deal with this situation? And some pundits are claiming that if we just kept taxes at higher levels, at historically high levels, then we could just, the problem would go away. It's obviously not true, but it is a rhetorical device they use. So my colleague Adam Michel ran the numbers and said, what would our deficit look like if we had historically high tax revenues, like what we saw during a very brief period during the pandemic, when tax revenue went up significantly? And the deficit line is the one on the bottom, is the blue one. And with historically high deficits, historically high revenue, which is the orange bar on the top, we would still run deficits. So 0 is at the top. So everything coming down is deficit. So it would make some difference, but not a whole lot. So the issue we have is that higher taxes are chasing much higher spending. Since the pandemic, spending has grown by 46%. So since 2019, spending has grown by 46%. Over that same time period, tax revenues have grown by 28%. Like, tax revenues are actually going up. It's just that they're chasing much, much higher spending. It's not because we have less tax revenue that we're in trouble. It's we have more tax revenue, but we're spending even faster. Okay, I must apologize. There's a mistake on this chart that I only saw 5 minutes before I came in here. The part that says Social Security payroll taxes on the bottom, that's actually meant to be individual income taxes. So if you can just do a little bit of a swap. The largest source of revenue in the United States is individual income taxes, is what you pay on your income, and then payroll taxes are the second largest. But what I want to illustrate here is this shows you what the federal government projects. We will collect in revenues and we will pay in spending over the next 75 years. This is a calculation that the Treasury produces in a report every year, and it's called the Financial Report of the U.S. government, and they look at the unfunded obligations, which is the difference between what we will spend and what we will collect in taxes. Obviously, a lot of things can happen over 75 years, so they assume the economy is growing at historical rates, and we spend with the same policies and we tax with the same policies right now, no changes. So under those assumptions, we will have an unfunded obligation, these are really big numbers, of about $80 trillion over the next 75 years. So like I said, our economy right now is about 26 trillion in size. So unfunded obligations in what economists call net present value terms, which is a fancy word for saying that this is how much money that if you invested it at current interest rates today, this is how much you would need to invest to cover that cost over that period. So that's more than 3 times our current GDP if we said, okay, we don't want to tax more, we don't want to spend less, let's just figure out where we're going to get this pot of money and just put it in the bank, and then we're going to draw it down over the next 75 years. This is kind of the way you can think about this. We don't have that money, at least our economy doesn't produce it on an annual basis. And it can kind of give you an idea for where we're going to spend most of our money over that time period. And Social Security, Medicare, non-defense discretionary is domestic programs like the EPA, etc. Defense discretionary, pretty self-explanatory. Medicaid and other mandatory are welfare programs, benefits for veterans, and those types of things. So we have an $80 trillion unfunded obligation. Now, one thing we did is we looked at, okay, Social Security and Medicare are supposed to be financed by dedicated taxes, so-called payroll taxes, which is why many people will say, this is an earned benefit. I have paid for these programs. The truth is that for Medicare, it's only true for a small portion, Medicare Part A. The largest and biggest spending components of Medicare are actually financed by general revenues, income taxes, not payroll taxes. People have not paid for those benefits. For Social Security, it's actually still true. Payroll taxes have covered, so far, all of Social Security spending, except that when Congress collected the money, they didn't actually save it. They spent it on other things. So we have had to borrow because Social Security is now running cash flow deficits. It's collecting less in payroll taxes than we're paying out, but we collected more in the past, so we should credit it to Social Security. I have no problem with that, even though we're already borrowing the money for that. So what we did is said, okay, Medicare and Social Security are supposed to be self-funded, and then if we look at that 80 trillion gap, our unfunded obligation over 75 years, what are the key drivers of that, given that, what's the shortfall in payroll taxes to fund these programs, and then what's left for everything else from income taxes, et cetera. And what we identified is that of that $80 trillion, 95% of that entire unfunded obligation is due to two programs: Medicare, 2/3, and Social Security, 1/3, and then all other expenditures. And so what that tells us is that if we actually want to tackle the biggest drivers of our unfunded obligations, which is what we are spending in excess of what we made provision to pay for, and if we're not talking about Medicare and Social Security, what are we even talking about? We're talking about a rounding error. We could eliminate defense spending. That is not a recommendation. It wouldn't make a damn bit of difference, pardon my language. And so Medicare and Social Security is where it's at. Now, the good news, there is actually a change we could make in Social Security where we do not need to cut anyone's benefits. Your grandparents, your parents can receive Social Security at the current level, adjusted for inflation, so we would make sure that the benefits are protected from changes in prices due to inflation. But we would not make the benefits more generous each and every year, because the biggest driver of the Social Security imbalance is that we've decided to adjust the initial Social Security benefit for wages instead of prices. And so what that means is that when I go and I apply for Social Security benefits, the wages I earned in early 2000 get adjusted for wage growth to the year where I claim my benefits. And so all of the improvements in the economy, productivity enhancements, et cetera, that have raised wages, not for me, for other people, get credited to me in the form of a higher Social Security benefit. And so we calculated the difference where we looked at an example where, okay, base benefit in 2020, this is someone who applies for Social Security benefits in 2020. If there were a high earner who paid the maximum Social Security payroll taxes for most of their life, they would be eligible for an individual benefit of about $45,000 a year. If they're an average earner, it would be much less, about $18,500 a year. Over the next 25 years, their benefit would be adjusted for prices for inflation. So that's that darker bar in the middle. So that person's benefit who applied in 2020 got $45,000 in 2020. By 2045 would collect a little over $91,000. So that tells you what we expect inflation to be over that time period, about halving the value of our money. And that's, under very sensible assumption that perhaps are not, very accurate given our debt situation. But let's grant the current inflation assumptions. However, someone with the same earnings history who could have worked in the exact same job, made the exact same wages, paid the exact same Social Security taxes as the person who applied in 2020, when they apply for benefits in 2045, you would think they will get the same benefit because they paid the same taxes and had the same earnings, but instead of collecting $91,000 a year, they're going to collect more than $114,000 a year just because they applied 25 years later. And so this is called wage indexing, which was adopted in the 1970s and is the primary culprit for why Social Security has become unsustainable. So if we just move to price indexing, we could preserve that $45,000 benefit over that 25-year period for inflation, so it would be the same value, and we just wouldn't give them that excess benefit increase from wage growth, and we could actually solve the Social Security trust fund problem. The Social Security Administration modeled this proposal, and they found that if we adopted price indexing, so inflation of current Social Security benefits, there's three policies here right now. There's current policies is the bottom line, where you see we have the increasing deficit. That's the Social Security Trust Fund deficit, the gap we need to fill, or seniors will face, on average, a $12,000 annual benefit cut, which is about 23% of their benefits. That's the bottom line. That's the situation we're in right now, current policy. And that benefit cut would take place in 2033. Then we have the purple line in the middle, progressive price indexing. What that would do is say, we will continue to wage adjust, adopt the more generous index, if you will, for anyone in the bottom 30% of earnings. So we would not touch those people's benefits at all. They would continue on the same policy. We could solve the Social Security funding crisis before the 75th year. We would actually reach solvency. It would be more slowly, but we would get there. Under price indexing, we would actually have Social Security surpluses, and we could increase benefits, say, for the lowest income seniors, for example. So that would be price indexing for everyone. We wouldn't protect the bottom 30%. Most politicians that have considered this proposal have been more amenable to progressive price indexing, holding harmless everyone in the bottom 30% of earnings. And 71% of Americans, according to a recent poll, support reducing Social Security benefits for higher income earners. So this should be a very popular proposal. Okay, but if you recall what I said earlier, Social Security is not unsustainable. It is underfunded. We do have a trust fund problem that we're going to need to resolve. But there are fixes. Like I said, there's even fairly easy, should be quite popular solutions out there. But the big issue is actually Medicare and overall healthcare spending in the United States. That is going to be a trickier problem to solve. At the Cato Institute, we believe that the best way to reduce the waste and the administrative overhead that is driving up costs of US healthcare compared to everyone else in the world, without necessarily providing better quality care, we're just paying more for it, that the best way to resolve this is to introduce more market competition in what has become a highly consolidated sector. And so we have been advocating for what we call big HSAs. So instead of the government making all the policies for how much doctors will get paid for procedures and running it through this fee-for-service model in large part through Medicare and Medicaid, we would give the money that the government allocates for your healthcare directly to you. And then you would use it to buy healthcare in the marketplace. And you would care more about what that healthcare costs, because if you could buy a lower cost plan, find a lower cost provider that you were happy with, you could keep the difference. It could go towards your retirement. So we would empower you to make better choices about your healthcare and put pressure on the providers to keep prices reasonable, to reduce administrative overhead, to eliminate waste, not bother you with unnecessary tests just because they can get paid by the government to do so, and through that even benefit you directly, leaving more money in your pocket. That's our recommendation for that. This is a chart from my friends at the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget. And what they looked at is, okay, the blue line, CBO baseline for the debt, is basically the same line, just smoothed out over the next 30 years that you saw in the first graphic. It's us going from about 100% of GDP debt to almost 200% of GDP debt. That's our current scenario. So they looked at, what if we said every trust fund we have, Medicare, Social Security, and the Highways Trust Fund, we would just fix those problems. How much of a difference would that make? And they do that with a combination of spending cuts and tax increases. And debt would grow to about 136% of GDP if we fixed Medicare, Social Security, and the Highway Trust Fund with a combination of spending cuts and tax increases. And then they have their own reform plan, which they would make other changes, not just to those programs, and they would try to stabilize the debt at about 110% of GDP. Very briefly, what's going on in Congress, you might have heard Senator Romney and Senator Manchin introduced a plan called the Fiscal Stability Act. It is a companion to a House bill that was introduced in early September called the Fiscal Commission Act. Congress is finally beginning to grapple with the fact that we have a highly unsustainable fiscal scenario that they're unlikely going to fix without help. So they're thinking about establishing a commission to help Congress solve this problem. Unfortunately, they have not yet learned the lessons of failed commissions of the past. So my big goal is to help educate Congress that setting up a fiscal commission is a great idea, but we gotta get one put together that will actually work, which means we have to look at the fiscal commissions that have failed and understand why they have failed, and then design this fiscal commission, which we need to work because we are in such a precarious situation now, such that it actually has a chance. And so the one fiscal commission in the US context that has actually worked is the Base Realignment and Closure Commission that was set up after the Cold War to close obsolete military bases. It was called BRAC. And BRAC had two key components. It was made up of independent members, not members of Congress, but experts, so that it gave Congress political cover to do what was politically impossible, closing military bases in their districts. And it allowed for a fast-track mechanism in Congress where members of Congress did not have to affirmatively vote for closing military bases. Instead, the president took the up or down vote. President represents the entire nation. And Congress had the option of rejecting the BRAC Commission's proposal, but if they didn't do anything, the recommendations would go into effect. So I think those things are key. A majority of independent experts should make up the commission, any commission that Congress sets up, so they have a chance to come to agreement. And I think it should go through Congress with a default approval, with silent approval, where Congress doesn't have to take an affirmative vote. Because given the politics and the fact that if we don't reform Medicare and Social Security, nothing else matters, because they make up so much of our unfunded obligations, 95%, and Congress will not be politically able to take that hit, I think they should empower a fiscal commission with real authority. And now I'd like to take questions.